Hey everybody, welcome back. Good morning. Hope you guys are doing really good. Just I think things started a few minutes prior to 10, but we got 4 minutes or so, and then we'll jump into today's Monday meeting. Hope you had a great weekend. And yeah, just get comfortable. We'll get rolling then in a little bit. All right, guys, a couple more minutes. Feel free to say hi or good morning or just anything you like in the chat there. Hello, Tristan. Good to see you there. Glad. Awesome. Morning to you too. Hope you guys' first couple weeks of classes have been pretty smooth. Hi, Caroline. Always nice to see all you guys. Hi, Lee, Davey, Parker, Rachel. Awesome, everybody. Chloe. Appreciate you guys' attendance. It's just another minute or so. Awesome. Okay. Awesome. Good to see you guys. Hi, Martina, Michael, and everyone else in the chat. All right, it's 10 a.m. now. Usually the numbers in this group seem to jump up a little bit as we reach the first few minutes of class time. So anyways, guys, good morning. Welcome back. Hope you had a great weekend. Anything happened this weekend? I guess NFL football is back. So that's always fun. Hi there, Pono. But yeah, guys, so right now we are just continuing through our lecture series. We're basically right on schedule with the calendar that you see in the syllabus. One little update is that I'm going to send you guys the essay prompts later today. That's going to be after I'm done teaching some other classes that I have today till around 4. And I might have a little student office hour meeting at a different campus on Zoom, obviously, but from 4 to like 4:30. So anyway, I'm telling you later in the afternoon, maybe early evening, I'll send the prompts for the first essay topic. That I'm also going to make a slight adjustment to the due date. The due date listed in the syllabus would have been 28th of September, 2 weeks from today, but I just want to provide a little additional time, so I'm going to give you until Wednesday the 30th, and I'll give you that information in the Canvas message that I send to the class. So yeah, later today you'll get those essay prompts. There's going to be 2 topics, and you can choose which one you'd like to write on. And when we start the top of the meeting on Wednesday, we'll go over the prompts to open the class. So anyways, that's just one little thing. We're going to get the first essay prompts out and have 15 days in total to compose your essay and send it in to me. But more detailed questions about the prompts and the construction of the essay, we'll hold that, I guess, for Wednesday. We'll go over it in good detail on the beginning of the meeting. Okay, so anybody wondering, about the first essays, they're coming out today, the prompts anyway. All right, so then other than that, let me just recap some of the things that we've done leading up to today, and especially the material from the last meeting, especially after the weekend, and just in general. I like to kind of bring us back into what we had done before. So we're on the philosophy of religion. The first essay prompts are on that topic as well. But anyway, that's our first major subject of the course. We've studied and considered different arguments for the existence of God, and then objections to the arguments. So to give balance, we're just trying to understand all the available positions and arguments on all sides. So the main big 3 arguments that we looked at to begin were the ontological argument, which says that God has to exist because the definition of God is greatest conceivable being. Then there's the cosmological argument, which says that everything has to have a cause. That's the principle of sufficient reason. And if everything has to have a cause, then the universe must have one. The distinction between contingent and necessary truths is mentioned, that contingent things have to have a cause, and the universe seems to be contingent. So what's the cause of the universe? Well, it can't be the universe itself, because that's the thing to be explained, so it can't also be the thing which causes itself. It can't be something contingent which causes the universe, because that would simply lead to an infinite regress, which is thought of as impossible. Since if there was a contingent cause to the universe, it would not be the first cause. Since being contingent, it would have to have a cause of its own. So whatever the first cause is then, and since it can't be just an infinite series of contingent things, the first cause must be something that's a necessary being, and that would be God. And then there was the design argument, which says that if there's something with a purpose or a function, it has to have a creator. The example of the watch is used to make the point. With the case of a watch, it's immediately obvious to anybody that it had to come about from an intelligent creator, because the watch can tell time, therefore it has a purpose and a function, and all the little parts of the watch have to be very precisely assembled in order for it to conduct that function. So obviously reason tells you that a watch could not exist if not for the existence of intelligence and an intelligent creator. Now, then the analogy is given that the works of nature also in many cases exhibit purpose and function and a detailed, complex arrangement of parts, like the case of the eye or the vocal cords or the digestive system or the ears, the nose, whatever. Any of these different naturally occurring things do show an impressive amount of architectural design, if you like, and they conduct a function. So if the watch must have had a creator, then so much more obviously must the works of nature have had a creator, because they exhibit a purpose and a function like the watch does, maybe even more impressively so. And that creator of nature, the designer of nature, the watchmaker of the works of nature is like God. Okay, after those arguments, we looked at the writing of Ernest Nagel. Nagel just went out to criticize all the available major theist arguments and to try and show his objections to them. So he said of the cosmological argument that it seems, first of all, not clear that everything has to have a cause, which is assumed in the argument. Another point he makes is that even if everything has to have a cause, it perhaps is inconsistent to then claim that God does not have a cause. So how can both of these claims sit side by side? All things must have a cause, and God has no cause. So you could argue if everything has to have a cause, then God should have to have one also. A third issue he mentioned was that if God does not have to have a cause, as the argument claims, then there could be something with no cause. And if so, why couldn't the universe just be the uncaused necessary being? After all, the universe is known to exist, and there's no doubt or disagreement about that. So if there had to be something which is a necessary being, at least with the universe, it's something that's existence is undisputed. And then the last issue that Nagel mentioned with the cosmological argument is he says, is an infinite regress really something that is impossible? Maybe it's not impossible. Keep in mind, the cosmological argument said that an infinite regress could never exist. There can't be an infinite sequence of causes that has led us to this point in time. So it has to start somewhere, and it has to start with something that's not contingent. But Nagel says maybe an infinite sequence of causes is not incomprehensible, because after all, we do have ways of thinking about infinity from the fields of mathematics, geometry, set theory. And so therefore, if we have a comprehension of actual infinity in those ways, how come we cannot simply apply that to our thinking about the timeline of events in the universe's history? Maybe it's also actually infinite, like the points on a line. Okay. After having critiqued that argument, he stated his objection to the ontological argument, which was sort of like G.E. Moore's point that existence is not a predicate. He gave the example of the $100 bill. And then he provided his criticism of the design argument, which, first of all, he said, the only real reason that we know that a watch has a maker is not because it has a purpose or function. It's just because we've never seen a watch that was not designed, and that's because we make watches. But in considering the case of the works of nature, although they don't all have a purpose or a function, like think of a black hole or something, but considering the things that are in nature which have a purpose or function, there's a different way of explaining how they came to acquire those functions, aside from the hypothesis of a creator or a designer, and that would be the alternative of Darwinian biology and evolution. So if we can explain purpose in nature without any creator, then there's no need to hold the analogy as the watchmaker is to the watch as God is to the works of nature. Concerning the works of nature, there's a different viable explanation for how they could acquire a purpose. So no assumption of a creator is given or needed. And then he also provided quickly his statement of two different arguments for God's existence and quickly his response and rebuttal to them. One was the argument that the world would be too unfair if there wasn't God, because if there's no God, then there's no one to reward the virtuous or to punish the wicked. And that means that bad things could happen to good people and they would never receive their just deserts in heaven. And good things could happen to bad people and they would never receive their righteous punishment in the afterlife. But if God exists, then he can balance these things out by dispensing divine justice after life is over. Nonetheless, as much as that argument has some appeal, the author Nagel says it's not so great as an argument because it sounds more like it's the projection of what is hoped for instead of what's based on good evidence. Surely it's a hopeful thing to imagine that this is a just universe ruled by a benevolent creator, but that's not the same thing as saying here's solid evidence to prove it. So he thinks it's not really something that's based on evidence, but rather hope. And then there was also the argument from religious experience. The idea that someone says, I believe God exists because I had this powerful religious moment where either a miracle seemed to have happened or a prayer was answered, or I just felt like a transcendent connection to everything and I could see the being of God revealed to me. Well, from those types of experiences, some will claim, I now know that God exists. But as an argument given to a skeptic, the author Nagel says that these are weak in terms of their power to persuade. Because first of all, the experience can't be shared to another person. So the experience is private to the individual who had it. Therefore, it can't be given as to others to verify or inspect. So one problem with the argument is it's based on experiences that cannot possibly be shared. The other problem is that there are also different explanations of these reported experiences that could be natural and not supernatural. Like someone could argue, oh, well, it was really a claimed experience because the person was on drugs or sleep deprived or emotionally unstable, mentally ill. So whatever the case is, there are different ways to explain the experiences, and they can't be provided for the person's own review. The last thing Nagel said was the problem of evil. Problem of evil says that if there was a God, there wouldn't be any evil in the world because he'd be all powerful and all good. Being all powerful, he could do anything, including stop the evil. And being all good, he wouldn't like evil. So if there was God, given his omnipotence and omnibenevolence, there would not be evil. But second premise, there is evil. So the conclusion then follows that there's no God. That's the argument. Some object to it, of course, by saying that evil isn't real. It's just an illusion. It just seems that there's evil because you can't see the big plan that God has. But Nagel says that's not the best objection to him anyway, because even apparent evil, if it's an illusion, is not ideal. And he says we could just as well speculate that there's no such thing as good and everything's for the worst. Our congenial assumption that evil is an illusion and everything's for the best. It seems more, again, like it's taking a standpoint of our hopes and wishful thinking. So that was everything from Nagel. The last piece from last lecture, as I'm launching into this kind of review, was the Blaise Pascal, Pascal's wager. So just a very quick statement of his argument. He says, first of all, no one could prove whether God exists or not, because if he exists, he's way beyond the human mind's ability to comprehend. So we are not going to ever be able to prove or disprove his existence. He says that flat out right at the beginning. So his goal is not to prove God exists, but just to convince you that it's better for you to believe in him, even if you can't prove it. He says it's kind of like a coin flip. Now, with a coin flip, say it's going to land heads or tails, and you get to choose which side. It's kind of like that because with the case of God's existence, it's going to either be that he exists or he doesn't exist. It's got to be one of the two. And you just are in a position where you have to make a choice. Which do you think it's going to be? You're going to believe that he will or that he won't, that he does or that he doesn't exist. Now, with a real bet, like a coin flip, you don't have to bet. You could say, I don't want to take any stance. I'm not picking heads or tails. But Pascal says you cannot avoid wagering on the question of God's existence, because if you say, hey, I'm taking no view about it, that's basically casting your view with non-believers. So you're kind of locked into having to choose one way or the other. So the question is then, what's the better bet? And as Heath says it, it's much better to just choose to believe in God. The simple reason is basically this, because if you believe and you win everything. And if you lose, you basically lose nothing. But if you don't believe and you win nothing. But if you lose everything. So choosing to believe holds out the possibility of going to heaven if you're right. But if you're wrong, there's not really much that you lose. If you believed in God and it turned out that he didn't exist, then if anything, you've just spent more time maintaining religious faith and the practice of your religion than other people did. And I guess in that case it was for nothing, but not a big loss. So to believe in God holds out the possibility of a great reward and doesn't really risk much loss. But if you don't believe in God, you're risking a huge loss without the possibility of even gaining much if you're right. So if you don't believe in God and you're right, I mean, you haven't really won anything. If anything, you've gotten a little bit of more time in your life, I guess, to not be focused on religion. But if you choose to not believe in God and you are wrong and he does exist, then you would be either going to hell or at the very least not provided the rewards of heaven. So why would you go ahead and believe? Why would you go ahead and choose not to believe and expose yourself to those risks when the other bet exposes you to really no risk? So one bet is all possible upside without much downside, and the other bet is all pretty much downside with no real upside. So if you're forced to wager one of these two ways, take the safer bet that exposes you to less risk and holds out the possibility of a better reward. He says if you didn't do that, you'd actually be being unreasonable, because reasonable people are usually risk averse. So let me read his words on this, and then that's where we'll finish the discussion of Pascal. And then we're moving on today to a new author, same topic, but it's W.K. Clifford. So Pascal says, you must wager, there's no choice, you're already committed. Either God is or he is not, but which view shall we be inclined to? Reason can't decide. At the far end of this infinite distance, a coin is being spun, which will come down heads or tails. It's a metaphor, like the choice of God or not. It's kind of like heads or tails. How will you wager? Reason can't make you choose either, and reason can't prove either wrong. Well, he says, Let us weigh up the gain and the loss involved in calling heads that God exists. Let us assess the two cases. Well, if you win everything, and if you lose nothing. Don't hesitate then. Wager that he does exist. He says here, you would have to play, and it would be unwise of you, once you are obligated to play, not to risk your life in order to win 3 at a game in which there is an equal chance of losing and winning. But there is an eternity of life and happiness if you go to heaven. That being so, even though there were an infinite number of chances, of which only 1 was in your favor, you'd still be right to wager 1 in order to win 2, and you'd be acting wrongly, being obliged to play, in refusing to stake 1 life against 3, in a game where out of an infinite number of chances there is 1 in your favor, if there were an infinity of infinitely happy life to be won. But here there is an infinity of infinitely happy life to be won. 1 chance of winning against a finite number of chances of losing, and what you are staking is finite, so that leaves no choice. Wherever there is infinity and where there are not infinite chances of losing against that of winning, there is no room for hesitation. You must give everything. And thus, since you are obliged to play, you would be renouncing reason if you hoard your life rather than risk it for an infinite gain, just as likely to occur as a loss amounting to nothing. Yeah. So now, Alec, you asked me, do we go over all of this during last lecture? Well, if someone can tell me. According to my memory, we did cover the Pascal. Isn't that true? Who can tell me about the Pascal? Did I show you guys this individual example of like the coin flip and stuff? If I have not, then I'll back up and go over it in a little more detail. But Alec, I see your question, so let me know to those attending. The information, the material on Pascal's wager, guys. What do we know? How much of it was covered in the previous meeting is my question about Pascal. All the other stuff is from previous lectures before that. Pono, you're saying I don't think we did. Okay. Well, just who could tell me where we ended then in the last meeting? I may have overshot a little bit with my reference to the Pascal. You got as far as the cosmological argument from Nagel, and so you still have to learn a little bit about the remaining objections that he did give. Good. Well, I tried to go over some of that today, just in the beginning, but let me try and slow down and make a mention of it in a little bit more of a slow format. So from Nagel's article, right, the Does God Exist article, we studied and talked about all the objections that he has to the cosmological argument. He also has some additional criticisms of the other 2 big arguments too. So briefly, his objection to the ontological argument, that's one that I would not create a bunch of notes for because it's very similar to the G.E. Moore objection, which says that existence is not a predicate. So I'm creating the heading here, Nagel's objections. We talked about the objections first to the cosmological argument. And since that was covered in the previous lecture, you'd have your notes on that. The objections mentioned were, number 1, is it true that everything must have a cause? Number 2, if everything has to have a cause, then why not God also? The third objection was, if there could be things with no cause, then why not suppose that the universe has no cause? And the fourth problematic feature of the cosmological argument, he said, was that maybe an infinite regress is not impossible, because we can, in fact, understand the concept of actual infinity from mathematics. Like, for example, that there's always another decimal in between any 2 numbers, no matter how close those 2 numbers are on the number line. Therefore, there's an actual infinity of numeric values between even the 2 smallest intervals of numeric value. Therefore, maybe the infinite sequence of events leading back into the past could be similar to that number line. My question one last time to you guys, and thanks for your contribution here to the chat. We talked about those points at least, right? The cosmological argument objections from Nagel. Just checking with you. Want to make sure that that didn't get left behind. So those points, the Nagel points on cosmological, good. So further beyond that, he has criticism of the ontological argument. So this is ontological argument criticism. Existence is not a predicate, which is similar to what G.E. Moore said. Now, the example that Nagel uses to make this point is just a slightly different example. He says, suppose there's a $100 bill, right? So we all know a $100 bill, like the $100 bill, Benjamin Franklin, big, now they're blue-faced kind of currency. It used to be green. Okay, so I don't know if any of you guys right now sitting watching this lecture have a $100 bill like in your wallet or in your pocket, but whether you do or don't, the definition of $100 bills is the same. So it's not like if you have like acquired such a bill, the definition changes as opposed to when you don't have the bill. Yeah, well, Rachel, we could all use, I guess, a lot of them, but the point here is simply that whether you have it or not, the definition is the same. So existence or non-existence of these hundreds doesn't change the definition, okay? It's kind of then the same with the idea of God. He says, whether the being exists or not is different from whether we're defining it. I'll give you a different take source. Right? They don't exist, they're extinct. But we've heard and seen the movie Jurassic Park, right? So suppose that in theory we could regenerate these things by taking extracted DNA and replicating them to life size. In that case, dinosaurs would start existing again after we did that. But in the interval of time when they didn't exist and when we brought them back and then when we drop a nuke on Jurassic Park because it's out of control, now they're extinct again, existing, not existing, back to existing, the definition's not changing through that whole process. The definition of the attributes of the dinosaur remains stable, and it doesn't have any effect on whether they exist or don't exist. So that's another way of making the same kind of point that Moore made, that if something's definition has existence in it, that's inappropriate because whether it exists or not is not really part of how you define a thing, okay? His example was the $100 bill example. Whether it's in my wallet or not, the definition's the same. So whether God exists or not, the definition of him is the same definition. Therefore, existence can't be part of the definition. Okay, now, the design argument, he has two big problems with the argument from design. Okay, problem number one, he says the only reason that we know, I'll put it this way, the real reason that we know that the watch has a maker is because we make watches, not because it has a function. Okay, so that's one problem. He says the whole design argument, if you look at Paley's original writing, it's based on an analogy between something that's found in nature and something like a watch. And the claim is that since the watch has all this, function and purpose, we know it has a designer, and therefore the works of nature which have a purpose or function, they must have a designer too. But now Nagel is trying to say this analogy is a bad analogy, the comparison of the watch with the eye. A comparison of a man-made thing that has purpose and a natural thing that has purpose. It's a bad analogy, and why? Because the only real reason that we know the watch has a maker is not because it has a function at all. It's just because we've never seen a watch that was not designed because we make the watches ourselves. Okay, so we only know the watch has a maker because literally we make them. But when we now consider the case of nature, the design or the purpose that is seen in the works of nature can be explained on a much better supported hypothesis. You can explain that without assuming there's any creator by just utilizing the idea of Darwinian biology and the theory of evolution. So I'll put that point here. So the second objection to the design argument I'm putting up above, the purpose or function of things in nature can be explained better by the theory of evolution. Okay, so the claim is that if you're trying to explain how things in nature could possibly have a purpose or a function, that can be explained without any need to assume the existence of a divine creator, because the theory of evolution in Darwinian biology provides the ability to explain that naturalistically. As you guys probably know, if you studied a little of the high school or college biology, the theory of evolution says that over a very long scale of time, organisms will gradually be selected for that have traits which enhance their ability to survive in their environment. Basically, randomly distributed genetic mutations, the ones that equip the organism better for survival, are going to lead to their greater numbers surviving and therefore reproducing in greater numbers. So the selected for traits therefore naturalistically get selected for, and the ones that don't enhance survival, they just die off, and so they don't get to mate and reproduce, carry on their genetic line. So over very, very long geologic timescales, this breeds into the species the adaptations that enable it to survive and thrive in its own environment, without any assumption throughout that there's any guiding hand from an intelligence like a watchmaker. So he thinks, does Nagel, that the design argument is weak in these two ways. First of all, because we can know that a watch has a maker even if it has nothing to do with it having a function, just because we make watches. And then secondly, because in the case of the works of nature, they can be explained without any assumption of a creator if we just use the hypothesis of the Darwin theory. Okay, now, after that, there were those two additional arguments, just miscellaneous arguments for God's existence that Nagel quickly just raises and then dismisses. Okay, so I can just label this as two miscellaneous arguments for God's existence. They're not like the most central in the literature. They're not the big three that we've all kind of learned, but they're out there and he wants to quickly present them and just try to set them aside. So okay, so one we will just call the argument from unfairness. And then the other one could be called the argument from religious experience. Sorry, yeah, so argument from unfairness, argument from religious experience. The argument from unfairness basically just says that God has to exist, because if God didn't exist, the world that we are in would just be too unfair. So because otherwise the world would be too unfair. Okay, so the way this argument works is as follows. Someone makes the case that suppose there was no God. If there was no God, then there would not be justice in the world, and that is just not conceivable. Therefore, there has to be God. Now, how is it that if there wasn't a God, the world would be too unfair? Basically, let me ask you a question. Do bad things ever happen to good people? Does that ever happen? Any precedent for that? Bad things happening to good people? What do you know? Let me hear from you. What do you think? Is that something that can or has happened ever? Bad things to a good person? Sure. Sad to say, I know. But it definitely has happened, and it will happen, and it's probably even happening right now somewhere. Bad things can happen to good people. People could get killed, abducted, tortured, raped. I mean, all kinds of horrifying things. Little children getting shot up at school. So yeah, bad things can happen to good people. Can good things happen to bad people? Can that ever happen? Can like a bad person that's living wickedly, living wrong, enjoy happiness and feeling good? Sure, that can happen too. That's also sad. Right? Can there be people who've committed horrifying crimes that never got held accountable and felt good about their life, and that was it? They just passed on with no accountability. Definitely that can happen too. Sad to say that. Now, what could restore justice to this non-ideal situation that I'm describing here? You know, what could make it okay that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people if it existed? What could balance out these wrongs? If what? What could make that fair? What could be a way of getting fairness to the person, let's say, who suffered through their life, but they lived virtuously? Heaven and hell, good. So the idea of God is that he dispenses justice on Judgment Day, right? So if you lived really well, if you lived virtuously and righteously, but you suffered in your life, then God could right the scales of justice by providing you with the benefit of heaven in the afterlife. You say rectified in the future, but Parker, I'm talking about like after you're dead, right? Because in some cases, there won't be rectification during your mortal existence. So suppose then that the person could be compensated for the harms and sufferings by a reward of heaven. That would make it okay. On the other hand, a bad person that like did everything wrong and lived punished in the life by deprived of heaven. So if there's God, he can reward the good people, punish the evildoers, even if they didn't get their just deserts in life. And in some cases, like we've talked about, people don't get their just deserts in life. The good person goes unrewarded, the bad person goes unpunished. But if there's a God, he makes sure everybody gets what they deserve in the end. Now, if there's no God, then it's just unfair. Bad people thrive sometimes and nothing happens to them, and good people suffer and they never get anything as a reward. So that's the argument. There's got to be a God, otherwise this is just a hopelessly unfair world for those reasons. But the critic, Nagel, keep in mind the big picture, we're looking at Nagel's article and he's an atheist. So he says, I hear the argument, but I still find it problematic, I find it defective, because he just says this: that's not a good argument because it's not proof. We've heard it said that the life is not fair. You know, haven't your parents said that to you a million times, or somebody's told you that? You've heard the saying, life's not fair. I find it to be a kind of sad saying, a little cynical, right? Because what are we supposed to do with the information? Life's not fair, so just don't expect it to be fair. Don't try and make it more fair. Whatever. People take it as a truism that life's not fair. So this seems to run contrary to that. And many people's intuitions might be like, who said it was fair? I'm not convinced that it necessarily is. So he says this sounds a little bit more like a projection of hope and wish than something that can be claimed as based on good evidence. So it's not really a proof of God exists. It's more like, if he exists, that'd be so much better and so much nicer. So let's hope for that. But that's not the same as proof. The second one here, the argument from religious experience. Okay. So this argument is the idea that someone claims God must exist because they had a powerful religious experience. One says that God exists because they had a powerful religious experience. Now, this is an interesting argument for God's existence because I find that a lot of people rely on such an argument. At least some do, as I've encountered many people on the topic. It doesn't take a very like a studied student in philosophy to make such an argument. It's something like, I had this powerful, vivid experience, and after that, I just know that God exists. So you imagine this interaction. Someone says to another person, do you believe in God? They say, yes. And they say, okay, why? Why do you believe in God? What's your argument? And they say, well, here's my argument. I basically had this one experience. After that, it was just made very, it was totally clear to me, evident, God's real. Now, what do you think could be a so-called religious experience? There's a variety of possibilities. But what do you think could be the sort of description of what we're talking about when we mention a religious experience? Could be like what? Maybe such a thing as, like what would be the sort of thing that after this, the person says, that convinced me God is real. People die for a second, think they've seen heaven. Yes, so it could be the reputed near-death experiences. That's one case, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. Praying for something and then it coming true, good. So like the deliverance of a prayer. The DMT, well, yeah, sure, I don't know. We're taking it as the case where a person thought they had really had such an experience, but surely under the influence of some substances, people will attest to having like experiences of the divine. But it doesn't need to be just that one case. So there's a lot of possible ways. One could be that the person thought like some miracle was performed in their life. Another case could be that they had a brush with death that they narrowly escaped and they thought that God provided the providence. In other cases, they could have just had like, I don't know, like a transcendent moment where they thought they had like a kind of communion with God or some kind of presence that seemed to have descended upon them in the midst of prayer, meditation, or a moment of deep psychological distress. So after such an experience, someone uses that as their evidence to make the case God exists. Now, his objection to this is also, I think, straightforward. He said the problem with the argument is two problems. First of all, this experience cannot be shared to other people. So to the skeptic who hears the report, they're not going to be able to like look at the experience themselves and have that experience. So to a third party, it lacks persuasive power, so says Nagel, because after all, these experiences are forever private. They're locked away in your memory and in your own psychology. So you can't like with other kinds of evidence, you can show the evidence to someone. You can say, if you don't believe this is the killer, here, look at this fingerprint that we found at the crime scene. But in this case, there's nothing I can show another person. I just have to say, take my word for it. I had this experience. Now, if you're dealing with another theist, a fellow believer, that person already believes in God. So they're going to be like, oh, you had one of those experiences? Me too, high five. But like if you're talking to an if you make an argument, usually you're making an argument to a person who doesn't already agree with you. What else would be the point, right? So to a skeptic, they're not just going to take the claim at face value, and you can't share it to them. The other problem he mentions is that there's always other explanations for these claimed experiences. What could be a sort of naturalistic explanation for the proffered experience? It could be, like some have said here, drugs, influence of chemicals on their brain. It could be sleep deprivation. It could be some type of mental illness or psychological breakdown or whatever. It could just be a heightened state of suggestibility. Now, that's not to dismiss the existence of these experiences, but since a skeptic will more likely explain it in one of these ways, there's always going to be alternative explanations for them. Therefore, he thinks that they can't be absolutely compelling and convincing. It is kind of non-falsifiable, Stephen, which is a very high-level concept. In science, we say that claims that are not falsifiable are not scientific because they can't be tested. It's sort of like that, right? The person who claims there's ghosts, but if you don't believe in them, you can't see them. It's kind of like that. Okay, so that closes the door on these two extra arguments that he gives. And I briefly mentioned to you guys the problem of evil. That's where Nagel closes his paper, the problem of evil. So the problem of evil is a little different in our class because to this point, all we did was study arguments that God does exist and then criticisms of them. But we haven't looked at any argument which tries to go for the opposite conclusion, that there's no God. And this is one such argument that's pretty famous, or at least well known. It goes back thousands of years to the early Christian days. And it's called the problem of evil. So the problem of evil is an argument containing two premises that lead to this conclusion here below. In logic, a lot of times we diagram arguments in this format where the premises are listed, maybe sometimes numbered, and then there's a horizontal line which divides them from the conclusion at the bottom. Now, the conclusion of an argument is the statement that you're trying to prove to be true, and the premises are the evidence or the reasons that back up and support the conclusion. So in this problem of evil argument that Nagel is now going to present, the first premise just says that if God existed, there would be no evil in the world. So sorry, it's a little compressed, but what it says is if God existed, then there would be no evil in the world. And the second premise then just says that, but there is evil in the world. So the conclusion of the argument, if you can deduce, it's what they call in logic the inference of modus tollens, what is the conclusion? If God existed, there would not be evil, but there is evil, and therefore, well, I think you can derive it, but it's the conclusion that therefore God does not exist. So if we examine the argument, let's just take a look at each premise. The first premise says that if God existed, there would not be any evil in the world. Now, why do you think that somebody would make that claim? What is it about, the nature of God and evil that would make evil not exist in case God did? It so says the argument. I'm not saying you believe that, of course, but we're just looking at the argument theoretically. Why do you believe that someone might claim that in case there was God, there just wouldn't be evil? What is it about God that would contradict the existence of evil? What do you think? Just asking this quick question. As you look at the argument and you look at the first premise, why do you think someone would claim that statement, that if there was God, then there would not be evil? Because if God existed, putting yourself in the mind frame of the argument, the proponent of the argument. Just let me know. I believe I even mentioned it in passing at the beginning, so I kind of spoiled it. Well, because God is just, that's one part, yes, Stephen, because he's thought of as omnibenevolent, but also because he's all-powerful, omnipotent. Good, correct, Hono. So being omnibenevolent and omnipotent, jointly, those two features would seem to cancel out the possibility of evil. Because having all power, as God is claimed to have, would mean that he's almighty, so he could do anything he wants, including just eliminate evil just through his will. Since he's got all power, he could do anything. And since he's perfectly good, he would want, you would think, for there not to be evil, because evil is the contrary of good. So a perfectly powerful and benevolent being would not allow evil, but nonetheless, there is evil in the world. So second premise is easy to explain, and we've already kind of touched on it. There's evil stuff that happens in the world. I mean, 9/11 anniversary was just on Friday. There's a lot of people dying in the world, doing nothing wrong, being victimized in all kinds of ways. So bad things happen in this world. If there was a God, though, that wouldn't happen. So there must not be a God. That's how the conclusion is derived. Now, I'm seeing your comment here, Stephen. In most religious texts, the reason that evil exists is so that humans can have free will. I understand that, yes. And that's type of objection that's usually given here. So as we've studied objections to all the different theist arguments, we're also going to, of course, consider some objections to this. Like, what are the problems with this argument? Davey, you say evil is a man-made thing. Humans are given free will at birth so that they may love him freely. Okay, well, here's the thing, though. I'm just playing devil's advocate, almost literally in this case. But couldn't there be free will, but people just don't choose to do evil? I mean, I don't see why that's not possible. Like, for example, I have free will, but I don't do anything evil. Like, and same with you, right? I mean, you could do evil things, but I assume that you don't take the worst, most evil actions, right? So, like, just because you have it's physically possible for you to kill a human being, doesn't mean you're going to do it, right? Like, so you can have free will, but not use the free will to do everything evil, right? What are you saying? Come on, humans, do better. I love it, devil's advocate. Yeah. So, I mean, think about a world like this. We're all free. We have the temptation to do evil, but we just don't want to. That does not seem impossible to me. Couldn't God have made it like that? Give us the freedom, but we just don't feel like it. We just don't feel like using our freedom to do that. Like me, I don't feel like killing people. Even if I have the free will as a human being to do all kinds of horrible things, I don't want to do it. So, why couldn't God have just made that the situation? In fact, let's go back to the Bible. In the book of Genesis, which is supposed to describe the initial conditions of man, right, in the Garden of Eden, it was paradise. It was paradise at first. Like, that was God's plan. Just let man and woman live in the Garden of Eden. It's an eternal paradise, right? But, so he brings in the snake. There's a temptation to eat from the tree of knowledge, right? Why did he have to tempt them with the serpent? He probably, of course, being omnipotent and omniscient, would know that this temptation would be taken. So how much free will is it? And is it necessary for us to act in a way that's evil, for us to preserve and have free will? I mean, I know that it's like trying to assign the blame to us for the existence of evil because it's our choices that allow us to do that. But a perfectly benevolent creator God could have still given us free will and just not had us with the inclination to make those choices. We still could watch all kinds of movies where there's fictional violence and stuff, like we do, in fact, in reality, and never having done it. So you can imagine people watching movies where murder is depicted, and they're like, wow, it's a horrible thing. I'm glad no one's ever actually done that, even though it's conceivable. So I've always stumbled on this point where people say, that settles the question. Why is there evil? Because humans have free will. Free will doesn't just mean you do evil. At least that's the way I would look at it. I've also had this one question always about the scriptures. Why is it eating from the tree of knowledge that is so bad? Knowledge is not a bad thing. So what's the underlying message here? The pursuit of knowledge makes you evil or satanic or something? Anyway, it's just some food for thought. But one objection, and we're just kind of getting in the mind of these objections, is that there's no such thing as evil. That's kind of like how you said it, Davey. And that's the popular objection to this. There's really no evil. It just looks that way from your limited close-up perspective as a human. But if you could take a step back and see everything like from a God's eye perspective, to coin a phrase, then you would see that what seems evil to you is really all for the best in the biggest possible picture of reality. But Nagel says there's a problem with that way of objecting. First of all, even if evil is just a so-called illusion, it's still really rough. It's still not so ideal to have this even illusory evil. So like, say there's someone who's suffering in a torture chamber, like some kind of unjustified persecution in some terrible dictatorship somewhere in the world, and you poke your head in there and you're like, don't worry, evil's not real. It's all for the best. God has a plan. It's going to be kind of cold comfort to that individual who's suffering still through the even appearance of evil, if that's what it is. And the second thing Nagel says on top of this is that not only is even the illusion of evil not so great, but how come you don't just assume the opposite, that there's no such thing as goodness? And what appears to be goodness is really just an illusion. And it's all a setup because it's all for the worst. And the universe is ruled by like an evil overlord, the worst possible being. See, that belief is not nice. That's scary. The other one, though, that we're ruled by a benevolent being and it's all for the best, that sounds nice and congenial. So according to Nagel, it's only our kind of hopes and wishes that inclines us to believe in the more favorable rather than the less favorable assumption here. But there's equal evidence on both sides to support either one. So in the end, he doesn't really find there to be like fatal objections to this argument. But of course, we are each individual judges, and you may find the objections presented to it to be forceful. It's really just every individual who takes a class like this or who thinks about these questions on their own, whether in school or just on their own, comes to their own conclusions. So you may find this argument powerful, you may find the criticism powerful, and that's the same with all the other stuff that we've presented so far. Trying to imagine a religion where the creator is actually completely evil. I don't know why it's funny. Yeah, well, they talk about the devil and stuff. I don't know. I guess the concept of an evil supernatural being is out there in the mind of some, but I don't think anybody would. No. I mean, I'm just saying, for example, in case you believe that evil is an illusion, the author says, but how is that any more or less evident than saying good is just an illusion? Not that he's positing that that's true, but he's just saying they're both equally kind of on an equal footing. And therefore, there's not any more rational support for the one than the other. So since one of them sounds better, it might seem as though it's not based on reason that that's the commitment of the individual, but rather their hope. I'll read it to you. You can hear how he put it. It's not about no mention of Satan or anything like that. He says, okay, so another gambit often played in attempting to, much atheistic criticism is also directed toward exposing incoherence in the thesis of theism. I'll restrict myself to the central difficulty in the theistic position, which arises from the attribution of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. The difficulty is of reconciling these attributes with the occurrence of evil. Accordingly, the question to which I now turn is whether, despite the existence of evil, it's possible to construct a theodicy which will justify the ways of an infinitely powerful and just God to man. One way to object is to maintain that what is commonly called evil is only an illusion, or at worst, the absence of good. So like, evil's nothing, there's just light, and where evil exists, it's like the absence of light, so it's not a thing in its own right. He says, evil may indeed only be an appearance and not genuine, but this does not eliminate from the realm of appearance the tragedies, sufferings, and iniquities which men so frequently endure. he says, another gambit often played to justify the ways of God to man is to argue that the things we call evil are only evil because they're viewed in isolation, and when they're viewed in the proper perspective, they are seen to be all for the best. He says it's an appropriate retort to this argument that, of course, we judge things to be evil in a human perspective, but since that we are not God, that's the only way we could judge them. And he says, however, we're not this other part of creation. It's irrelevant that were we something other than what we are, our evaluations of what is good and bad would be different. Moreover, and this is the key point that I mentioned, and we'll close with this, the worthlessness of the argument becomes more evident if we remind ourselves that it is unsupported speculation to suppose that whatever is evil in a finite perspective is good from the perspective of the totality of things. The argument could be turned around. What we judge to be good is good only because it is viewed in isolation. When viewed in the proper perspective and in relation to the whole bigger picture, it is an evil. So, why believe in universal optimism instead of universal pessimism? It doesn't seem that a rational argument can be given as to why one is more, reasonable than the other one. Okay, guys. It's not all Satanism. Satanism is a totally different thing. There's like books and stuff that people wrote in the 20th century, and they have to do with like radical ego gratification. The 7 vices and stuff like that. This has nothing to do with that. It's a theoretical idea of like, could evil be the standing condition of the universe rather than good if we flipped our assumptions 180. Okay, guys. So very good discussion. Thanks everybody for helping and making sure that we got everything in there. I had somehow thought that I had included a few more of the notes on the Nagel at the beginning. So thank you very much for slowing me down and going back over it. The next piece, W.K. Clifford, which follows after this discussion of Pascal that we will open with on Wednesday, that goes pretty fast. So we'll be able to catch up fully at that time, and we'll talk about the essay prompts as well. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys go, but I see that Stephen has a question. If you have it, go ahead and throw it in there, and I'll stay in the chat for just a minute. But to everybody who's been here in the meeting, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate all of your participation, and I'll see you back on Wednesday. Stephen, you say, if omnipotence is a contradiction, then would accepting that God is a contradiction necessarily disprove his existence? You mean omnipotence? Like, well, sometimes people say that thank you guys. Sometimes people say that omnipotence and omniscience cancel each other out, that they contradict each other. Because think about this. If God knows everything that's going to happen, then he also knows what he himself is going to do, right? But if he knows what he's going to do, that means that he doesn't have the power to do something else. So like if God knows that like he's going to create an earthquake in some part of the world like later today, then he has to know that because he's omniscient, right? It can't be that it happens as a surprise. But if he already knows in advance that it's going to happen, then it seems that that limits his ability to do otherwise, because if he has the power to do otherwise, then he can't necessarily know that that's going to happen. So if you really try to think about the magnification of each of his qualities to the limit, they sometimes have been argued by atheists and skeptics to contradict each other. I don't know if that does disprove his existence, or if we just say that God works in mysterious ways or something like this to rehabilitate the conception from these critics. But there's a lot of clever argumentation that's been done to try and settle those issues in the dispute between theists and atheists. So that's all I can say in brief right now. But you have a very fair point that you raised there, Stephen. Okay, so to everybody, thank you for hanging in there and sticking around for that little postscript. We have more to talk about next time then, Stephen. So hold the thoughts, and we'll cover it on the Wednesday meeting, okay? Things can be contradictions but still exist. Ooh, I don't know if I can agree with that. Doesn't that sound illogical? I mean, if there's a contradiction, then what one thing says is true is contradicted by what the other statement says is true. Unless you believe that we live in like a reality where there are contradictions. But even in quantum physics, they say that the two contradictory outcomes of, like, I don't know, the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment happen either in two different branches of quantum reality, or that the superpositions collapse at the last to the one outcome. So even in, I think, quantum physics, there's no straightforward embrace of total contradiction, but it's closer than what had been thought previous to the 20th to 21st century. So, okay, guys, well, food for thought, very deep. Thanks again, and have a great day. I'll see you back on Wednesday.